computer. Okay, perfect. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. On today's program, we are rejoined by Tyler Shipley. Tyler is a historian with a critical leftist perspective, part of what I call Canada's truth-telling, myth-busting movement, which includes people like past guests Yves Engler, Dimiti Lascaris, Richard Sanders, the Canada Files, and various old and new that spend their time exposing Canada's bloody imperial past, its ongoing pro-corporate and pro-Anglo-American pan-European hegemony, and linking it to the ongoing struggles for justice for Indigenous folks and others, and of course exposing the severe limitations to liberal democracy. He is, as I mentioned, a historian, but his official title is Professor of Culture, Society, and Commerce at the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Humber College Institute of Technology and Advanced Learning. And Tyler is author of Ottawa and Empire, Canada and the Military Coup in Honduras, and Canada and the World, Settler Capitalism and the Colonial Imagination. So first off, Tyler, thank you. Thanks for coming back on the program.
Thanks, Youri. Thanks for having me.
It's a real honor to have you back on the program. And the first thing I wanted to ask you, Tyler, is I was struggling in preparing for the program because you're one of those guests where I can practically talk to you about anything and everything, which means it's hard to know which topic specifically I want to talk to you about. But I decided since today, Friday, it's International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and since I've been rather dismayed by large parts of the mostly white socialist, white Marxist left and others, and many things that there needs to be a choice between identity politics versus the class struggles, as opposed to chewing gum and walking at the same time, or slaying three evils with one stone or one semi-automatic. And we see the rise of the far right and traditional right-wing parties only going further right on economics and playing footsies with social conservatism. And I just don't see much pushback. So with that, and with the world war that is happening right now, and the far right movements are nearly close to advancing their hideous agenda, I just wanted to know what is your thoughts on that, and what do you think should be the left's the left's response to the far right of today? Before we talk about my official questions.
I mean, I think, when we get to talking about the far right of yesterday, I think it'll actually help us a lot in kind of giving us a roadmap, arguably a roadmap of what not to do. But certainly, as the left, I think we have to be even more careful than usual, or than we have in the past, about being very precise in our critique. And what I mean by that is, in the 90s and early 2000s, when I was sort of coming into political activism, the far right wasn't as prominent as it is now. And so it felt like you could sort of have a fairly simplistic left perspective. Corporations are bad. Yeah. Capitalism is bad. The bosses are bad, and so on. And it was fine. You could kind of squeak by with that. You didn't have to be more precise, because the right was simply saying, no, capitalism's great. The corporations are great. What's the problem? Today, you have the emergence of, I think, a much cleverer version of the far right, which tries to co-opt parts of traditional left analysis. And this isn't new. The Nazi Party did this. Mussolini's fascist party, the original fascist party, framed itself as being a working class party. In many ways, that's what distinguishes fascism from capitalist authoritarianism. In fascism, it is marketed and it tries to mobilize the masses in support of what is a deeply reactionary politics. And so today, I think we're starting to really see that. And I'm thinking specifically of this, they call it patriotic socialism, but this kind of strand that has emerged where leftists or former leftists kind of drift over into a kind of right-wing anti bosses or anti bankers, but from a patriotic or nationalist perspective, as though this is like a legitimate form of left politics, and it's not. It's fundamentally reactionary. A nationalist politics always ends up excluding certain people from the nation, and that invariably means non-white people, which means non-white workers. So this is not a class-based. As soon as you start talking in terms of nationalism, you're not talking in terms of class. You're talking, on a very different level. And so these patriotic socialist things, the socialism gets marginalized and the patriotism is what comes forward. And so I think for us on the left, we have to be really aware that this is growing, that this is sort of bubbling. You see it if you're on Twitter, you notice, especially the more superficial sort of left figures, Twitch streamers and so on, who start off sounding, like they're pretty solid. And then gradually just start drifting, and you just, you notice one after another kind of strange sounding position that they take, and eventually they just end up being on the far right instead. So I don't know. That's a pretty vague answer to your question. You're welcome to sort of push it further, but I think we need to be very careful about being precise in our analysis, knowing exactly what we stand for, exactly what we stand against. And not slipping into what might seem easy. It might seem easy sometimes to just play along with nationalism because it's in the air. People generally go for it. You can attract a wide sort of base of support by playing up nationalism. But to me, it is ultimately nationalism and patriotism are ultimately deeply reactionary, and they only go down reactionary roads. So
I completely agree with you. And we might even return to what you were referring to what you were just referring to. I know exactly what you mean, but we'll play telekinetic right there and let the audience figure out what the reference was. But anyhow, let's but yes, we might return to what you were just saying. But all right, on to today. So I want to talk about World War II, what the lessons that that we can learn, and also some reflections since it is International Holocaust Remembrance Day. So describe the Canada that existed in the 1930s before the outbreak of World War II, and talk about how, surprise, surprise, Canada was quite supportive of the Nazi and fascist movements in Europe, notably, of course, Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and the fascist governments of Portugal and the rising Spain. And we'll talk about Japan in a little bit, but yeah, talk about Canada's de facto support for all of those movements, which later became far-right reactionary governments.
Yeah, I mean, it's in the way that our history sort of was written and is remembered. You would think that Canada had always just been this staunch anti-fascist, pillar, that Canada had always stood strong in the face of fascism. And, that couldn't be further from the truth. Canada in the 1930s, and, to be clear, when I say Canada stood with fascism, I'm usually talking about the ruling class, because there were a lot of working class people in Canada who were anti-fascist, and I think we'll probably talk about them a little bit when we get to talking about Spain. But the ruling class in Canada was very oriented towards the right. And as fascism emerges, keep in mind, it only really emerges as an ideology in this period, right? But as it emerges, it becomes very clear that the kind of the sort of liberal democratic capitalism that existed in the West was actually very amenable to the fascisms that were cropping up in Europe and in Asia. And so as they crop up, as Mussolini comes to power in Italy in the 1920s, and as obviously fascism rises in Spain and Germany later, Canada is very receptive. Officially, the official Canadian ruling class is very receptive to those movements. And there is a bubbling fascist movement in Canada as well. So, to sort of maybe start with that, if you took a snapshot of Canada in the 1930s, you would see swastika clubs, in cities like Toronto. Famously, the swastika clubs showed up to a Jewish baseball game. One of the teams was Jewish in a baseball game over at Christie Pitts, not far from where I am right now. And during the game, I think this happened in I want to say 33, 34. I might have been a bit later, but sometime in the mid 1930s, they unfurl a massive swastika banner. Obviously, they were there to intimidate the Jewish baseball team.
Wow.
Now, this story has a happy ending, actually, because a brawl basically ensues after the game. And the neighborhood around Christie Pitts at the time was a very working class Jewish and Italian neighborhood. And they basically beat the hell out of these Nazis in the streets of Toronto. The brawl raged through the night.
I'm hearing,
and the police...
I'm hearing Dead Kennedys, Nazi punks. So,
yeah. Yeah, totally. And the police chief, Dennis Draper, was himself basically a fascist. And sided with the fascists. And so he knew that this was happening and had sent the police elsewhere. He had created, I think he called them red squads, to bust up unions and attack labor organizers and socialists. And so he sent the bulk of his force to a different part of the city to break up a union meeting, knowing that the swastika clubs had planned this, whatever you want to call it, assault or intimidation against the baseball team. But the upshot of it was that the swastika clubs were the ones that got beaten up because, the neighborhood came out in defense of the baseball players and of themselves, really. The community defended itself against the swastika club. So,
wow.
That one had a happy ending. But nevertheless, in cities like Winnipeg, in Quebec, in Vancouver, in Ottawa, in most big cities in Canada, there were growing fascist movements. In Quebec, it was the Chemise Bleue. In Winnipeg, it was Walt Whitaker's. Is that his name? Walt Whitaker, I think was his name, who was training fascist brown shirts in Winnipeg and being allowed to do so by the mayor, Ralph Webb, who had provided space for them in the army barracks. So, you see over and over again in Canada in the 1930s that there is a sort of bubbling fascist movement down below that is being supported up at the top. And of course, that brings us back around to the Canadian state, the ruling class, which, greeted the rise of fascism very warmly. When it comes to, let's say Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia, Canada made no complaint, had no problem with this. With respect to the rise of Nazi Germany, Canada is actively supportive. I think the only way you can really put it is that Canada was an active supporter of the rise of fascism. Canada and most of the British Empire and sort of the Anglo brain trust viewed the rise of fascism in Germany as a sort of a check or a balance against the growing Soviet presence, the Soviet Union. The Russian Revolution happens in 1917. The Western states invade Russia immediately to try to destroy the revolution, but they fail. And by 1920, the Soviet Union is consolidated, and it's clear that the West is not going to be able to, destroy it, so they retreat, and the Soviet Union is allowed to develop. But the rise of fascism and Hitler's ideology around the so-called Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy, which was and remains a really central ideological point for the far right. And it's this idiotic idea that there is this conspiracy of Jewish communists, essentially.
Yeah.
All communists are Jewish, all Jews are communists, it's all kind of interwoven.
And of course, these Jews, they control all of the banks, which is why the working class and whatnot, are being exploited, right? Or
yeah, that's exactly the claim. The claim that the Jews are all these, these sort of corrupt, banker, greedy, selfish bankers, which draws on a very old version of anti-Semitism, one that has deep roots in Europe. But then the fascist movements of the 1920s and 30s modernized it. and by linking it to anti-communism, which is the sort of a newer and more contemporary reactionary politics. I mean, what are reactionaries in capitalism most afraid of? What are they reacting to more than anything? Well, of course, it's communism. I mean, it's movements that oppose capitalism's very existence. And so communism is always going to be one of the scariest. It is the specter that will always haunt capitalism. And so what fascism of its day does, and not everywhere, because in Italy, the anti-Semitic part of it wasn't as strong. But in Germany, the anti-Semitic aspect of it is, obviously runs really deep. And it's taking an old form of reactionary politics, an old racial hatred, and then wedding it to a contemporary, reactionary politics, that is communism. And the one other thing I'll say about that in terms of its roots is that this especially happens in Germany because in Germany, which had been a place, Weimar Germany was a place that was one of the least anti-Semitic places in Western Europe. And so there were a lot of Jews, a lot of people who had moved to Germany to get away from anti-Semitism in places like France. And the Jews.
I did not know that. That's quite new to me. Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting, right? Because we think of Germany as being the heart of anti-Semitism in Europe. And of course, there's a good reason it does become that. But France was, in the generation before, far more viciously anti-Semitic than Germany was. Germany was seen as a refuge by comparison to other places. What the fascists do is they link the rise of left politics in Germany to the larger numbers of Jews that have moved to Germany. And so in particular, the narrative is of the end of the First World War, when German workers rise up in revolt, a socialist revolt against the German state, and thus pull Germany out of the First World War. Hitler is among the minority of German soldiers who wanted the war to continue, wanted to keep fighting for the glory of Germany in the First World War. And he and others view the German Revolution of 1919 as being backstabbed, as being a treacherous act against the glory of Germany. Here again, patriotism, nationalism, operating very centrally in fascist ideology, even though it was a working class revolution, a working class revolt, and it was working class people that were dying in the trenches. Fascism says the more important thing is the nation, and the nation was stabbed in the back by this revolution. Hitler adds to the mix that this was a Jewish operation, that the German Revolution was led by Jews. The socialists are all Jews. It was the Jews that therefore stabbed Germany in the back. That's the claim. And so in that way, Nazi Germany really pulls together the old racism of anti-Semitism with the new reactionary politics of anti-communism and blends those together. All of that had a very, very welcome reception in Canada, where the Canadian ruling class shared both the fear of communism, the fear of the left, and also that deeply ingrained hatred of Jews. So someone like Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King, who in his career had long expressed anti-Semitism. He'd even at one point lobbied to block a Jewish family from buying a house near his estate. So he has a long history of anti-Semitism, and that links up very well with, it's the 1930s. There has been this rise of left-wing activity. All of the ruling classes of Europe and North America are terrified at the rise of all of this revolutionary activity. So link these two things together, and you found your perfect enemy, right? That is the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy that sort of runs through the heart of fascism. It did back then. It still does now if you look carefully today. And we can come back to that, but it's still there in contemporary fascist politics. So, I haven't given you all of the details, but I've been going on for a long time here about kind of the roots of fascism. And there's many ways in which the Canadian ruling class specifically articulates its support for that project.
Unbelievable. And can you talk about Canada's complicity in not defending the Spanish Republic, which was a democratic socialist government, and of course the fascist resistance to them, and the Spanish Civil War. Talk about and talk so talk about that, and talk about those Canadian leftists who fought in the aid of the Spanish left against Franco's fascist forces. And stupid question, but why do you think the Spanish Civil War isn't taught widely in schools of all ages, given that this was the first major confrontation of Nazism, fascism, and this was basically the pilot to the tragic series we know as World War II?
Yeah, that's a good angle into Canada's role in all of this, because the Spanish Civil War breaks out in 1936. There's a revolution in Spain in 1931. They overthrow the monarchy, and then an election in 1936, which is won by the left. A coalition of left-wing parties win the 1936 election. And at that point, a Spanish general, Francisco Franco, who was stationed in North Africa doing colonialism in North Africa, and rejects the victory of the left, brings his soldiers back to Spain to launch a rebellion against the legitimate Spanish democratic state. It quickly becomes clear that this is going to be a litmus test for the future of Europe. There is this new rising reactionary movement called fascism. In Spain, it had a particularly monarchist bent to it. So again, in Spain, the anti-Semitic character of it was not as strong as in Northern Europe, but the monarchist bent was much stronger. That was a really central part of fascism in Spain.
Yeah.
Makes sense given the history there, of course. And the government, the democratic government of Spain, is in a vulnerable position because they are a left government, and the only one at that point in Western Europe. And the question are the liberal democracies, the so-called liberal democracies of Europe, going to stand and defend a democratically elected left government in the face of a violent, a military invasion by a right-wing faction within that country? And obviously the answer is no, of course they're not going to defend a left government in Spain. They're going to side with the fascists. Both Nazi Germany and Mussolini's Italy are actively supporting Franco in Spain. Famously, the city of Guernica is bombed by Hitler's air force. Everyone in the world knows that it is Nazi planes that are bombing civilians in Spain, in part because the artist Pablo Picasso paints his famous mural.
And I've been to Madrid and actually have seen the painting up close and personal. And before you even go to see the painting, which people should actually see in person, because it's actually much more horrific than when you just watch it on your computer screen or on television. And before you actually see the painting, they show you films of the actual bombing of Guernica and so forth. So then after you've seen that, and then you see Pablo Picasso's Guernica, it's much more horrific. Sorry to interrupt, but just had to throw that in there. So.
Oh yeah, no, not at all. I've never been to Madrid. I would love to, and that sounds really cool. It's a really affecting. Even having not seen it in person, it's a very affecting painting, and it was taken to the 1937 World's Fair in Paris. So it's unveiled there at this, huge gathering of the bourgeoisies of the Western world. And they all saw it. Everyone saw it. Everyone knew about it. It was talked about. And that's in the summer of 1937. So, the fact that Nazi Germany is directly intervening to support a fascist coup in Spain is known to everyone. And still, the Western powers, Britain, France, Canada, the United States, agree to neutrality in the war. They agree at Hitler's request that they will remain neutral in the Spanish Civil War, even while Hitler himself is not remaining neutral, but is actively involved. And for Canada's part in this, Canada is directly asked by Hitler to maintain its neutrality. when Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King goes to Berlin in 1937, not long after the World's Fair, to meet Hitler and several high-ranking Nazi officials. And it's a pretty crucial moment, I think, for understanding Canada's position in all of this, because I've read all of Mackenzie King's diaries from this entire period.
And just in case viewers don't know who William Mackenzie King, he was the prime minister at the time of the Liberal Party.
He was of the Liberal Party, and he was the prime minister. He travels to Berlin for a series of meetings. He stops off in London first, where he confers with Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of England, and other British officials, including the King, actually, King George. King George was very concerned about the Reds. He was angry at the Spanish government. He was concerned about, and so therefore, supported this fascist coup. He is of the monarchy, and they were a monarchist group. And Mackenzie King's dialogue with Neville Chamberlain and the other British officials, it's very clear that the goal of King's visit to Nazi Germany is to convince Adolf Hitler to focus his energies on the Soviet Union. Everything about King's, and this is openly discussed between King and Chamberlain and the other British officials, they all think that what Hitler is doing is good. He's ridding Germany of the left. I mean, by that point, he's already murdered thousands of German leftists. Germany had one of the largest communist parties in Europe. I mean, this is something that is often forgotten. At the time that Hitler took power in 1933, the only other party that had even close to the same amount of strength as the Nazis was the Communist Party. There were millions of people voting for the Communist Party in Germany in 1933. Many of those people were murdered within the first 5 years of the Nazis' regime. And of course, this is great news from the standpoint of the West. The anti-communist West are thrilled that they have less reason to worry that Germany is going to go communist. There had been communist revolutions in Russia, in Germany, in Finland, in Ireland, in Hungary, in Spain. I mean, the left was bubbling everywhere. And this was of huge concern to the core capitalist countries. So
because it was a movement, because it was a force to be reckoned with.
Absolutely, because it was very clear.
So even if elections, even if they got a very small percentage, they were still a movement to be reckoned with. The
Absolutely.
Parties of the time.
Absolutely, it was very, very clear that working class people were sick of the shit that they had been given in capitalism, the shit lives, the shit opportunities, being sent off to die in the First World War, suffering through a Great Depression. People were sick of it. And therefore, they were joining socialist and communist parties. They were voting for socialist and communist parties, and they were also joining clandestine, militarily oriented communist parties. And so for the West, there is great concern about this, and fascism is an answer to that problem. I've seen that cartoon where fascism is portrayed as like a tiger in a cage, and the liberal, is opening the cage to use the tiger against the left. And of course, invariably the tiger, massacres the left, but then comes back and eats the liberals too. And that is exactly how it goes. That's exactly what happened in Weimar Germany. And so, to bring this back to Spain and the Spanish Civil War, the Canadian Prime Minister goes to Germany in 1937 with the goal of talking Hitler into focusing on the East, focus his attention on destroying the Soviet Union. And the West will let him do it, and they will not stop him, and they will not intervene. That is the message that King is conveying. He's also saying, if you mess with the British Empire, there's going to be a problem. There is only so much room for so many capitalist powers. We saw what happened in 1914 when the German Reich tried to assume a greater role in world capitalism. We had to beat you down. We don't want to do that again. We like what you're doing. Don't mess with the British Empire. Attack the Soviet Union, destroy communism. This is very explicitly what Mackenzie King's goal is in Nazi Germany. And so he goes to Germany, he goes to Berlin, and he has a wonderful time having those conversations. You should read his diaries. I mean, they are incredible chilling to read.
Yeah.
There are passages where he gushes about Adolf Hitler, his eyes, his hands, and so on. And in Canada, there have been a couple of articles in the mainstream about that, about the kind of weird way that King admired Adolf Hitler. But actually, I think that's not even the worst of it, because in Canada, that gets sort of set aside as, oh yeah, he was a weirdo. You know, he was a bit of a weird guy. He had seances with his cat.
Exactly.
You know,
he was eccentric.
he was eccentric. There was all kinds of stuff there, and his admiration of Hitler's eyes and so on. It gets brought into the realm of, oh, he was just a weirdo, which actually minimizes or almost invisibilizes the truly reactionary politics that were behind it. Because it wasn't just that King admired Hitler in some sort of mystical, strange way. It was explicitly that King agreed with the Nazis about Jews. You know, King writes in his diaries, I had this conversation with von Neurath. He told me that the Jews are taking over. They're getting into all the businesses. They're ruining everything. Something has to be done. I admit, you know, I understood where he was coming from. That's an almost direct quote. I'm paraphrasing slightly from memory, but that's almost a direct quote. He repeatedly talks about these meetings that he has with German officials, where they talk about the hideous nature of the Jew, and Mackenzie King, Prime Minister of Canada, agrees with them, and certainly isn't put off by it. You know, he describes one of these meetings as the most pleasant luncheon he's ever had, and he thinks he's going to be a longtime friend of Konstantin von Neurath in particular.
Wow.
During those meetings, Hitler asks Mackenzie King to assert Canada's neutrality in the Spanish Civil War. And immediately thereafter, Mackenzie King comes back to Canada feeling great about his visit with the Nazis and makes it illegal for Canadians to fight in the Spanish Civil War on the side of the Spanish Republic. And I know you know this, the reason that was necessary is because hundreds, more than 1,000 Canadians had gone independently to Spain to fight to defend the democratic Spanish Republic against fascism. So they were the first anti-fascists in Canada, and they had gone without the government's blessing. They are still today almost totally written out of Canadian history. It is very, very difficult to find anything out about them. They're not part of the pantheon that we're supposed to remember on Remembrance Day. But many of them died. Many of them, they were working class people. Some of them were homeless people who were working in labor camps at the time. And most of them were immigrants, recent immigrants to Canada. And they sacrificed themselves in the first great fight against fascism, which they lost because the Canadian, French, British, American states refused to give them support. And they were up against not just Franco, but Mussolini and Hitler too.
Well, stupid question is, why do you think the Spanish Civil War is not widely taught when we even talk about World War II, given that it was the first confrontation with fascism? And then another follow-up question, I wasn't planning on asking this question, but I do have to ask this, is, you know, the U.S. had FDR, had Franklin Delano Roosevelt at the time, and William Mackenzie King is liberal. So you know, why would these two New Dealers, this one liberal who did concede to a lot of workers' demands and did do a lot of nationalization, did do a lot of compensation for the plight of workers, you know, William Mackenzie King, you know, of Canada, and FDR, who created the New Dealer, who created the New Deal, and so forth. Why would they be okay with giving a certain amount of rights to workers and to the working class? And this is basically what the Spanish government, what the Spanish Republic, you know, what was going to do for their working class. And yet, why would they allow this poor left-wing government, which was going to do the same kind of policies they did in order to keep a lid on, on the full-blown working class revolution? Why would they allow they to be, you know, fed to the wolves of fascism? When I'm curious your thoughts, your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a couple things. It's in the first place, those concessions that were made to the working classes in North America were understood by the ruling class to be temporary. There was no question that capitalism was not going to be touched. That measures to mitigate against the worst excesses of the Depression were only that. They were mitigation, temporary mitigation measures, as you say, to put a lid on class struggle, to stop the strikes, to try to maintain a certain amount of labor peace to get through that period. But there was no prospect or possibility of any kind of genuine socialist movement being allowed in North America. And it's very different in Spain. I mean, some of the parties that comprise the electoral victory in 1936 are legitimate socialist parties. And in a context where so much of Europe had seen so much socialist and communist revolutionary activity, it was no stretch to think that left to its own devices, Spain would become a socialist state. And so presented with this opportunity, you've got this right-wing, militarized right-wing movement literally invading and taking over Spain. From the perspective of someone like Roosevelt or King, it was a no-brainer to side with that.
And the Spanish and the Spanish Republic was this certainly a much more radical left project compared to social democratic parties, which always come and go in waves and go in Europe. I know Eastern Europe. I think a lot of the governments were very monarchist, very very authoritarian, very very Orthodox or Catholic Church oriented, and yeah, England, of course, the monarch. Well, the monarch still has a lot of power, but of course, the monarch had much more power back then compared to what came after the war. So, and you mentioned that France was much more viciously anti-Semitic compared to what later becomes a Nazi Germany. So for them, so for a lot of those sort of governments, like something like what happened in Spain, they just could not, tolerate that.
Yeah. I mean, it was viewed as a serious left-wing threat, and what that means is more than anything, the threat of a good example. If the working classes were allowed to organize within Spain, and the coalition that won that election included a lot of legitimate socialists, communists, and anarchists as well, and had they been allowed to implement socialist policies in Spain, which no doubt would have been good for the masses of working people, what would stop French workers then from wanting the same thing? Because it was already clear by that point that there were a lot of French workers that wanted it. There had already been a socialist revolution in Germany, and as I say, there were millions of people in that communist party. What precedes the rise of Mussolini in Italy is the Biennio Rosso, which is the Red Years, 2 years of massive trade union mobilization and left-wing mobilization. There's a reason we call reactionary politics reactionary. It's because they are reacting to the left. And Mussolini arrives as a reaction to genuine left-wing radicalism in Italy. Hitler is a reaction to left-wing radicalism in Germany. So, yeah, Spain was viewed as a serious threat from that standpoint. And especially once the fascist powers sort of stake their claim. Once Hitler and Mussolini have gone all in and are saying, we are going to support Franco, we're going to make this happen. Now, then it becomes, is the West going to enter into a proxy war against Hitler and Mussolini in Spain? And given that the West was largely sympathetic to the rise of fascism, Churchill basically is a fascist who simply didn't have a domestic left to destroy. And he says that to Mussolini. He writes to Mussolini and says, had we had the same problems that you have had in Italy, I would have wholeheartedly been with you from start to finish in your your struggle against the bestial appetites of Leninism. Churchill is rabidly anti-communist and would 100% support fascism. Ironic, right? Because in our mythology of World War II, we think of Churchill as this, this great bastion against fascism. no one was more fascist in ideology in the UK than Winston Churchill. In fact, he was so genuinely fascist. He was so deeply fascist that he was among the first in the UK to recognize Hitler's full ambition was to replace the British Empire at the center of world capitalism, which is why Churchill eventually becomes anti-Nazi. And I want to say anti-Nazi, not anti-fascist.
Yeah.
But he becomes anti-Nazi because he recognizes that Nazi Germany is eventually going to try to replace the British Empire. But in 1937, they're not there yet. Most of the ruling classes of the West still think that fascist ambitions will be contained and that they are a useful tool against the socialist upsurge in Europe and especially the Soviet Union. So for all of those reasons, Canada is 100% on board with all of this. And I think, to quickly answer your question, why isn't the Spanish Civil War taught more in schools? Because it's really embarrassing. That has to be it. So much of the narrative here, still to this day, around the military and its contributions, is still anchored in World War II. So much of what I hear at Remembrance Day ceremonies here is about the struggle against the Nazis and the fight against Nazi Germany and all of the good that Canada did in there. And so to take note of the fact that a few years earlier, the Canadian government made it illegal to fight against fascism in Spain, when hundreds of Canadians wanted to fight against fascism in Spain. I mean, it just looks ridiculous, right? So I think it's embarrassing to the Canadian state to sort of, have to share that. And so they just don't. They just ignore it for the most part.
And you've already talked about how Canada was very much fine with Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and their partners in crime, and of course, of course, we shouldn't underestimate, that people at the time, the rabid anti-Semitism at the time. You've already talked about how William Mackenzie King of the Liberal Party was a raging, rabid anti-Semite, but so. In this question, can you talk about the treatment of Jewish people and others fleeing persecution of Nazi Germany and other places when coming to Canada, and how the government told them to F off, and talk about the one is too many or none is too many, because I think that will shock many people. And sorry if I'm laughing, folks. It's all nervous laughter, and it's all just. I'm just laughing at the dark farcical of all of this, because it's just amazing learning about all of this. So
no, it's laughing at the absurdity of that these things could have even happened, and the absurdity that we haven't been taught them. It's incredible to me, and especially given what we were just saying about the mythology of World War II. Most Canadians, I'm sure, if you asked them, would say, oh yeah, Canada, fought World War II because the Nazis were killing the Jews and it was really bad, and Canada went to save the Jews from, Hitler. And I wish it were.
Yeah.
I wish that were true. The reality is that the anti-Semitism ran so deep in Canada that throughout the war, before, during, and even after the Second World War, Canada refused to accept Jewish refugees who were fleeing the Holocaust, who were fleeing Nazi Germany, fleeing Vichy France. So the quote that you mentioned, none is too many, this was in answer to a question that was put to, I believe it was Charles Blair, the immigration minister, and he was asked, and I think this is in the early 1940s, how many Jewish refugees will Canada accept? Mm-hmm. And his answer was, none is too many. And None is Too Many became the title of a really groundbreaking book that I recommend to anyone interested in this particular topic, by Irving Abella and Troper. I forget his first name. But Troper and Abella's book, None is Too Many, is all about Canada's relationship to the Jews in the 1930s and 40s, both within Canada and those who were trying to escape from Europe.
But you said you said something which again still shocks me, because even though I know that, like, Canada, and not just Canada but much of the West, when Europeans were fleeing Nazi Germany or other occupied parts of the Nazi empire that that was growing. You said that even during World War II, so after Britain and France and then Canada declare war on Nazi Germany after the invasion of Poland, you said that even then, when folks were still fleeing for their lives, Canada still said you can't come in.
Yeah, that's right. As early as the middle of the 1930s, there are Jews in Canada who are demanding that Canada take action around Nazi Germany. People march up the street, Spadina Road, in Toronto, demanding that Canada accept refugees. Many of their family members who were trying to escape from Europe. Canada refuses. During the war, now I should clarify, Canada does ultimately accept a very small number of people. I think it ends up being a few thousand, perhaps, which is the lowest of any of the Western countries, including the U.S., Britain, and so on. But sorry, yeah, go ahead, Youri.
Wow. No. I'm just shocked hearing that.
Yeah, yeah. In 1943, there is, I think, a really sort of visible moment of all of this. In 1943, when the full scope of the Holocaust is known, and it was known before, like it's not an excuse early. There's no way that they can claim earlier, oh, we didn't know. No, they knew. But by 1943, there's absolutely no question because they've already started liberating some of the camps. So in 1943, there is to be a conference about what to do about the flood of Jewish refugees who are trying to escape from Europe. And Britain, France, and Britain, the United States, and Canada argue with one another over who will host this meeting, because they all believe that by hosting the meeting, they're going to take on more of the responsibility for actually dealing with the Jewish refugees. And so they agree to have it hosted in Bermuda. And that way it's on neutral territory. No one will feel pressured to accept Jewish refugees. So they go to Bermuda in 1943, and the discussion is so sickening, Youri, it would turn your stomach to read some of what was said at that meeting. There's actually a couple of quotes that I'm going to read you. I'm going to pull them. I'm going to find them and read them to you because I almost feel like you won't believe me unless I can read the actual quotes. So the Canadian Minister of Immigration, Charles Blair, argues that the Jews should be humiliated into changing certain habits that they possess. And Canada, the US, and the UK all agree that there was a concern, and this is a direct quote, that Germany would change from a policy of extermination to one of extrusion, embarrassing other countries by flooding them with alien immigrants. I'm going to read that again because I want that to sink in.
Wow.
Officials at this meeting are worried that Germany would change from a policy of extermination to one of extrusion, that means kicking people out, embarrassing other countries by flooding them with alien immigrants. So in 1943, Anglo-American and Canadian officials are worried that Germany will stop killing Jews and instead send them out as refugees, because then the Western countries will have to deal with them. Canadian Immigration Minister Charles Blair explicitly argued that countries should refuse to accept Jews in order to force Germany to solve its own Jewish problem. Which is right. I mean, it's just incredible stuff. To solve its own Jewish problem, that was Blair's words. We know that, in the language used at the time, the Holocaust was Germany's final solution of the Jewish problem, right? So, Nazi Germany solved its Jewish problem by mass murder, and Canada effectively encouraged that to keep happening, knowingly encouraged it to keep happening. This is pretty damning. I don't think there's really any way around that,
And yet it's stunning. And yet it's stunning because World War II is considered, the good war. It's considered we need to have wars. We need to have the responsibility to protect doctrine because of World War II, And I think to this day, I think people are still foolishly taught that. I mean, unless they have a teacher like the ones I had, like Mr. Binns or something like you, they're never ever going to be taught that no, World War II has nothing to do with saving Jewish people or any persecuted people. It's just that Nazi Germany was like two mobsters, the mob, was encroaching on another person's turf and therefore had to be met with the full weight of God by the other mobsters, right?
Yeah, that's a very good comparison, actually. I think that the sort of the mob fighting over turf, I mean, that's effectively what's happening in world capitalism in the first half of the 20th century. Two mobs are fighting over turf. One is centered around the sort of Anglo-American alliance, and the other is centered around Germany. And these are, the two centers of world capitalism at the time. And in both cases, Germany is trying to, take over its sort of central position. And what draws the West into conflict with Nazi Germany is that turf war. It is not an ideological abhorrence to fascism. At no point can we. Yeah, sorry, go on.
Yeah, actually, and before we talk more about that, then talk to us about how, actually, what was it? Yes, talk to us about how Canada, they were also openly supportive of even the hideous and barbaric regime of Japan at the time, their invasion of China, much of Asia. And was Canada the only major power that was supportive of Japan's action? And can you recall if there were others that were supportive of what of the Japanese monarch regimes, fascist regimes, invasion of China and much of Asia?
Yeah, I mean, Canada was maybe a bit more prominent in that case in some respects, but basically was always in lockstep with the UK and the US on this. They all supported Japan.
All of them. All of them.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. In the rise of now at different points that support recedes, and Canada clings to it longer than the others. In fact, Canada still clings to its relationship with Japan even when the UK, is moving into no, this is a threat to us now. But all three support Japan, and the logic is, I think, effectively this: colonialism is a system in which the European powers claimed that they were more advanced, more civilized, and that they were bringing, advancement and civilization to the rest of the world. By which they meant capitalism. They meant capitalism and exploitation, but they call it civilization and advancement and so on. And Japan frames itself after the First World War as a European-style colonial power. Okay. Japan, the sort of the modernizing elite in Japan around the turn of the century use the European powers as a bit of a guidepost. After the First World War, Japan goes to the League of Nations and says, we should be part of this. We think you should include us. The League of Nations, which is dominated by European powers, laughs at them and says, no, you're not white, get out of here. So Japan is pissed off about this. The Japanese elite are pissed off about this, and they basically embark on their own version of European colonialism in Asia. And the more that they do this, the more that they find a receptive audience in the West. Canada respects Japanese colonialism in Asia because it reminds Canadian officials of what they've done in North America. And to the extent that Japan is a capitalist power spreading a version of capitalism to different parts of Asia that had substantive communist movements. For instance, in China, there is a substantial growing communist presence in China. And when Japan is attacking mainland China, they're attacking a state that could otherwise have become a socialist state. And as we know, ultimately it did. But that's, in 1937, it's not clear what's going to happen in China, but there's certainly awareness that China could end up being another Soviet Union. That won't happen if the Japanese fascists take over, because they're fascists and they're capitalists.
And of course, and completely eradicate, trade unions first, but especially anyone that's a communist, since that's the most radical of the left that you have to eradicate, right?
Exactly, exactly. And that is exactly what the Japanese occupations around Asia are about. They're about establishing a fascist form of capitalism. So this is all pretty par for the course from the standpoint of European and North American powers. Canada has an envoy in Japan. It's established, I think, in the 1920s. And that envoy, on several occasions, as Japanese colonialism is ramping up, when they invade Manchuria, the envoy, I think his name is Randolph Bruce, says, Japan is just putting her neighbors into better shape and should have our support. Canadian officials back the Japanese after the assault in the city of Nanjing, which most people will know that was one of the most horrific assaults of all of Japanese fascism. Although there was much to be horrified by, that was a particularly bad one. Again, Canada justified that on Japan's behalf. Said, look, they're doing what needs to be done here. There's actually, to really get into the nuances of it, it's really fascinating to see the way the Canadian media portrays, the war in the Pacific at that time, because, I mean, especially on the West Coast, you have a deep-rooted anti-Asian racism. It's not specific to Japan or China. It's aimed at both. You take a city like Vancouver, where entire neighborhoods were burned down in, I believe it was 1907, during anti-Asian riots, where white people just literally burned down the Asian sections of the city. So there's a deep-rooted anti-Asian racism. But then as this sort of scenario plays out, where Japan is the colonizing power, bringing capitalism and civilization to the rest of Asia, the tone shifts. And what you get is a kind of paternalistic tone with respect to Japan. So, Vancouver newspapers will say things like, well, they're like a schoolyard bully. They're bullying their neighbors, and they need to learn how to handle these things more respectfully. But then it would go on to say, but obviously, the hordes of backwards Chinese need to be, brought into the modern world, and Japan is fit to do so. So, you have to sort of parse this out as Canada is being built ideologically on a racial hierarchy. There's a kind of racial ordering to this new Canadian society that's being built. And it's constantly placing different races at different levels of its imagined hierarchy. And because Japan emulates European colonialism and capitalism, Japan earns a higher place on this idiotic racial hierarchy. And so, the Canadian elite are happy to say, okay, well, we'll back Japan because it's doing something that is closest to what we want. Obviously, that all ends when the Japanese empire, like Germany's, begins to become a threat to the interests of Anglo-American capitalism. And that's why Japan ultimately still becomes an enemy in World War II.
It's funny because we hear this term, the yellow peril, which is often strongly associated with a xenophobia. So when the powers to be decided, okay, Hitler's too crazy for us, and he's cutting into again our turf. Same with Japan, which basically, if they had won the war, that was going to be the world order would have been Nazi Germany, Italy as a junior partner, and Japan basically controlling much of Asia. So did the powers to be and did the racist, even the liberal bigots of the time, did they have to switch the yellow peril from being we're afraid of Chinese people to, oh my gosh, we're afraid of Japanese people coming to invade us? I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated, ridiculous kind of game that they're playing, where they're having to kind of shift, the racial alliances. For a while, it's the Japanese are good and the Chinese are backwards, and then it quickly becomes no, actually, we're going to go and help the Chinese fight against Japan. But instructive in all of this is that despite the kind of consistent racism towards both Japanese and Chinese people and Koreans and anyone else in Asia.
which was
Despite
practiced
that,
with the internment camps, which we're not
oh
going to
yeah,
get into. But yes, the U.S. and Canada had the internment camps for Japanese Americans, Japanese Canadians.
yeah, absolutely. And even as that consistent thing is happening, there is still throughout this period and throughout the war, there is a pretty laser focus from the perspective of the West on communism and on the prospect of communist or socialist revolution. So even when Japan is defeated, obviously by the use of the horrific atomic weapons dropped on civilians, say something about that in a moment if you like, but at the point at which Japan surrenders and is defeated in the war, there's a question of what to do in China, because huge swaths of China had been occupied by Japan and were still occupied. There were still Japanese garrisons all over China.
Yeah.
But the resistance to Japanese imperialism had been led by the Communist Party of China. That was true in Korea as well, where Korean communists had led the resistance against fascist Japan. In fact, this is true of almost everywhere that had been occupied by fascist powers. The resistance in Greece, in Italy, in almost every place had been led by communists and socialists. And so the question becomes, well, what do we do about China? And the answer is so absurd, it's hard to even believe that in the immediate interim, for the immediate moment after Japan had surrendered to the Allies agreed to allow Japanese soldiers to work alongside the Allies to contain the Chinese Communist Party, until such time as the Allies felt they had full control over China themselves. They actually fought side by side with Japanese soldiers. This is 1945, immediately after the detonation of atomic weapons and the defeat, the unconditional surrender of Japan. Japanese and Allied soldiers fight side by side in China against the Chinese Communist Party. Canada sent aircraft to bomb the Chinese communists in 1946. So, it's like when you try to assess all of this,
and I imagine so they did that in China, but they also did that in Korea, which explains a lot why South Korea eventually was led by a right-wing junta, which had many of those elites collaborated with the Japanese, who did unspeakable, horrific crimes to them, and also and I assume this is the same thing in Indonesia. This is the same thing in Vietnam. This is the same thing in the Philippines. So the Allies, even though the Japanese were horrific to their POWs, the West weren't any better. But the Japanese, though, were very horrific to their POWs, very horrific to their subjects, their colonial subjects. And even then, the West could still find some kind of an alliance with the Japanese fascists, because for them the greater evil is communism and anything that's to the left of FDR and William Mackenzie King.
Exactly. And I think that's such an important thing to understand about this entire crisis of the 1930s and 40s, right? Is we've been taught for so long to think of it as good and evil. We were the good guys, the fascists were the bad guys. And of course, the fascists were the bad guys. I mean, that I can accept that. That is fine with me.
As Yves Engler says, World War II is probably the only war where you can say Canada justifiably was on right side of history. Yeah.
It ends up on the right side of history for all of the wrong reasons. But even running through that period in which Canada is on the right side of history, the fact that it's there for the wrong reasons comes out. It comes through. And so exactly like you've been describing, the priority in post-war China was to defeat the communists, even if that meant working with the Japanese fascists you had just fought against. And so what you get when you reflect on all of it is that this was not a war where the West had an ideological opposition to fascism. They had a tactical opposition.
Exactly.
Within the logic of capitalism and geopolitics, they had a tactical opposition to the German Empire and the Japanese Empire. But they did not have an ideological opposition to fascism. That's the lesson that we need to understand about the Second World War. And we can understand that that does mean that there were individual soldiers who fought against fascism, probably for the right reasons. I'm not here to disparage people's grandparents, and I know that sometimes people get that, well, my grandfather fought against the fascists. Don't tell me my grandfather didn't. I'm not here to say anything about your grandfather. Your grandfather might well have fought against the fascists, meaningfully knowing they were fascists. My Uncle Dick fought in the war. I'm fairly certain he was an anti-fascist in a legitimate way. But that doesn't mean that the state was anti-fascist. That doesn't mean that the overarching perspective of Canada or the United States or the UK was that it suddenly became anti-fascist. That doesn't make any sense. It wasn't anti-fascist before, and it immediately became not anti-fascist again as soon as those powers were defeated. I mean, the second the fascists have been kicked out of Greece, Winston Churchill's forces arrive in Athens. This is 1944. The war isn't even over. They arrive in Athens and say, okay, we're in charge. Greek communists who had defeated the Nazis and sent them packing respond by saying, actually, we're good. We already defeated the Nazis. They went that way. Go get them. Winston Churchill says, that's not good enough. We're in charge here. And when they don't accept, Winston Churchill's forces open fire on people in the streets of Athens, setting off a 5-year civil war in Greece to ensure that post-war Greece is run by the West and not by Greek communists. So to think that the war was about an ideological opposition to fascism is just foolish. It just makes absolutely no sense. And to me, that's the lesson that we have to pull out of this very complicated, historical moment where there's a lot going on. That to me is the key lesson that we need to take away.
Yeah, we also we won't talk about how Canada harbored runaway Nazi war criminals, runaway Nazi collaborators, because folks, folks should just go check out my interview with Richard Sanders. We spent a 2-hour-long conversation talking about that and how those very well-funded Eastern European civil society groups are behind the endless Cold Wars of today. But that is something worth checking out. But I think in sort of wrapping up then the conversation, we already talked about a lot of the stuff that this question addresses, but let's get into it. So with all that hidden, suppressed, and barely taught history of World War II and Canada, okay, when the British declared war on Germany, followed by its invasion of Poland, Canada was on the right side of history. But do you think World War II is often marketed and taught as the good war, that it's cynically used to justify more imperialism in the world? And talk about how it is, if you agree with that, overall much of humanity has done a disservice to those who perished in World War II, the soldiers killed, the victims of the crimes of the Nazis and Japanese. And of course, given, the state of Israel and the countless murderous far-right juntas, many of them with links to the Nazis, such as in Greece and South Korea, Latin America, the US and Canada and its allies harboring countless Eastern European and other of these Nazis. Any reflections on that? Because all of that was in the name of the true religion of these capitalist imperialists, which is anti-communism and much leftism with the Cold War, right? And is it long overdue that we need to answer that first before I ask this follow-up question then?
Yeah, no, I agree with you, and I think the legacy of the manipulation of our understanding of the Second World War has been really destructive. I mean, in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, the vast majority of people who survived it, well, I shouldn't say the vast majority, but in most countries where they were occupied by fascist powers, in most of those places, a majority of people were socialists. They came out of the experience completely disenchanted with the capitalist world and everything that came with it. In Italy, after the experience of fascism, I mean, Italy had been the central fascist power, the first, I should say, fascist power. And in Italy in 1946, the first elections after the war, the majority of people in Italy voted for either the Socialist or Communist Party. And by the way, the United States intervened and interfered in the next election to ensure that the Socialist Party would not win. So we've been manipulated in our understanding of what happened in that period of time. And the manipulation of the story from, I described it as Canada ends up on the right side of history for the wrong reasons. Mm-hmm. Being taught that it was the right side of history for the right reasons has given cover to every military intervention that the West has engaged in since then. When Canada joined the Korean War in 1950, Kim Il-sung was described as worse than Hitler. When Canada joined the Gulf War in Iraq in 1991, Saddam Hussein was described as worse than Hitler. In every single major world conflict since the Second World War, the chosen enemy of that conflict was described as some version of Hitler. And it's so deeply cynical to do that when the historical figure in question is not like Hitler. And there have been some that were, but Kim Il-sung was not one of them. Saddam Hussein, for all of the things that I would say critically of Saddam Hussein, Iraq was not a fascist state in the way that, I mean, there were no concentration camps. 6 million people weren't murdered in camps in Iraq prior to the Libya, 1991 Gulf War.
Or Libya, Gaddafi's Libya, Assad's...
An endless,
still trying to...
endless list of cases where we could say, even if we are critical of the leadership in these places, they're not Hitler. They're not fascists. And even in cases where there are, usually, I'm not even going to say usually, I'm going to say in every case, Western intervention is motivated by self-interest, not by ideological conviction. I would defy anyone to find me an example where the West intervenes, in a serious way in any place where it isn't in their self-interest. And so I think it does do a disservice. It does a disservice to, this is Holocaust Remembrance Day. It does a disservice to the people who died as a result of the fascist powers, which had Canadian support and encouragement. It does a disservice to Canadian and Allied soldiers who, in some cases very sincerely chose to sacrifice themselves in a struggle against, a series of truly evil regimes, fascist governments that needed to be defeated. It does just a tremendous disservice to, those people who fought in Spain, fought against fascism before it was sanctioned by the Canadian state, because they understood what fascism was and what it meant. It does a disservice to people who die in Canadian occupations of other countries today. 20 years occupying Afghanistan, doing incredible harm to the people of Afghanistan, and then having that justified every year in Canada with, oh, it's just like in World War II, we had to make a sacrifice to keep the world safe. So yeah, I think, it's a pretty serious problem, the way that memory is abused and misused in contemporary politics. I don't remember what the second part of your question was, but I think that's an important part of it for sure.
Yeah, and then I think sort of in closing, I actually had two more questions, but I'm going to save those for another interview because it's related to what we were first talking about, but I want to be respectful of your time. It is a Friday, so so I'm going to save these last two questions for another time. But I think in sort of wrapping up and closing, I then have to ask, this question, which is, when we talk about, World War II and how it's cynically used, do you think that it's time we move beyond World War II? That's long overdue, that we need to move beyond World War II. And what I mean is how we teach World War II that does the truth justice and helps us understand how the world system functions.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't frame it as moving beyond World War II. I would frame it the second way. I think what we need is a frank conversation rooted in historical fact instead of mythological narrative about what World War II was about, what was really at stake, what was really happening. I didn't even mention when I said that the disservice that is done in the misframing of World War II. I didn't even mention the 26 million Soviet citizens who died to defeat Nazi Germany, while the West sat and waited. Remember, before the war, the West had been perfectly content to let Hitler destroy the Soviet Union. The war starts, and the West basically sits and waits while Hitler invades the Soviet Union, almost conquers the Soviet Union, and the Soviets eventually push the Nazis back. By the time D-Day happens in 1944, which is the first significant Allied incursion into Europe from the West, the Soviets have already won the war. The Soviets have already militarily defeated the Nazis. It's already over. It's just a matter of exactly how is this all going to play out. 26 million people in the Soviet Union that died fighting fascism, and they're just written out of the story here. These things need to be written back into the story. I think rather than to say we need to move on from World War II, I think what we need is to actually meaningfully reinvest ourselves in understanding what was going on there. I think that's especially important because we are clearly entering a phase of world history that is going to echo with the crisis of 1914 to 45. In different pieces at different times, but that general crisis between the First and Second World Wars. We're clearly entering that now. We have the rise of fascism all around the world right now at record speed, including in our own societies. We have inter-imperial rivalry, which is how I would characterize the imperial bloc around China and Russia versus the imperial bloc, the dominant imperial bloc of the West. We have so many of the same dynamics that were at play in that period happening now. There has never been, I think, a more important time for us to revisit the story of the Second World War and understand what was the ruling class trying to do? What did the ruling class think it was doing? And what was the working class doing? And what did the working class think it was doing? There were a lot of working class people in North America who wanted to fight against fascism because they understood what fascism was and what it meant. That was not shared by the ruling class, even though they ended up on the same side for a little while. So I think it's time we understand that.
And do you think also, and do you also think that colleges, schools of all ages should actually be teaching kids about the Spanish Civil War, and if we are going to have commemoration days of soldiers who have died fighting in wars, I think we've done a complete disservice to the Spanish who were fighting, who were resisting a fascist takeover, and also their comrades in arms from all of those countries. And whatever criticisms people want to make of how Stalin conducted himself in the Spanish Civil War, which is a whole nother topic for a whole nother day. But the fact of the matter is this: while the West sat on their asses, Stalin was the only person that was fighting against fascism in World War in the Spanish Civil War. And when Hitler was mobilizing himself, and when Mussolini was mobilizing himself, and Stalin actually went to world leaders, particularly Winston Churchill, he kept trying to lobby them, saying, guys, a war is coming, and these are not people that you want on your front door. And France and England all literally gave him the cold shoulder. So that also needs to be emphasized, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of pieces of the story that need to be revisited meaningfully. And it's true, there is a lot of good reasons to criticize Stalin for his inaction in Spain. Had the Soviet Union...
Inaction in Spain, you mean?
Spain, sorry, what did I say? Yeah, Spain is what I meant. Inaction, his lack of action.
Stalin's inaction in Spain, or...
Yeah, what I mean is, had the Soviet Union been committed to victory in Spain, the Soviet Union could have ensured, or at least put up a serious, made it a serious possibility that Spain could have been saved. And I think that's a legitimate critique to be made of Stalin and the Soviet Union. But I think it is also equally legitimate to say, at least they did something. whereas the West literally refused to support even its own volunteers who wanted to go and fight against fascism. You know, you had that was the first major anti-fascist alliance of the Second World War, and the West was not part of it. And yeah, I mean, I think that's something that, you know, again, when you put it all on the balance sheet and try to parse together what actually happened, you come away with a very different perspective of what that period of time was all about. And that's what we need. We need to understand that so that we make clear judgments about what is happening today and what's going to happen tomorrow and so on. And I think it's long overdue. It's been a hard topic to pierce the armor of you know, the mythologies that have been built.
Well, I think that's a good place to end it. I had some other questions I wanted to ask you about. What do we do with the whole identity politics versus the class struggle, and the thing that you mentioned at the top about, you know, how some on the left are playing a little bit too much footsie with the far right. But we're going to save that conversation for another day. And I'm going to also, I'm going to have Tyler back on the program because I want to do a program where we talk about education and why does the right stubbornly want to keep education such an unequal leveling field, as well as the Liberal Party. I haven't done the program about the Liberal Party itself as an institution. Made a lot of references to the Liberal Party, but we've never actually like critically looked at the history of the Liberal Party and different prime ministers. But we're going to do a series of those conversations with Tyler all throughout the year and whenever Tyler has time. So before we end the program, we were joined on this edition of 1+1 with Tyler Shipley, superb historian and professor of culture, society, and commerce at the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Humber College Institute of Technology and Advanced Learning. Damn, that's quite a mouthful. And Tyler is the author of Ottawa and Empire, Canada and the Military Coup in Honduras, and Canada in the World, Settler Capitalism and the Colonial Imagination. So first off, Tyler, thanks for coming back on the program. I look forward to having you back on the program to explore, you know, some of the topics that, you know, that I would love to talk about with you. And I also, hopefully, we can also do a debate on, you know, the NDP and whether we should still invest in that. But until then, keep doing the great work you do. We'll make sure to post links to your work and other important related links. Until then, thank you so much, and you have a very good weekend, all right?
Thank you, my friend. Thanks for the interview. Great talking to you.
Likewise.